Our next speaker is a distinguished VP analyst at Gartner. This guy has been an analyst and immersed in the analyst community and industry for longer than the average age of your typical apprentice, which means that he absolutely knows his stuff. To talk to us about 10 best practices for scaling generative AI across the enterprise, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Arun Chandraskaran.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I am super excited to spend the next 45 minutes with you. My name is Arun. I work as an analyst at Gartner. I hope most of you have heard of Gartner. We are a research and advisory firm. And I primarily cover cloud and AI at Gartner. And I mostly work with CIOs and CTOs. Generative AI promises to be one of the most transformative technology trends of this decade. I was actually reviewing this presentation yesterday when I was in the flight. And my co-passengers happened to notice that I had generative AI in the title slide. And I probably spent the next 60 minutes arguing why AI will not take my job in the next 5 years and how humanity can be saved from AI in the next 15 years. So that's the level of interest, sheer interest that we see from AI, both in our personal lives and our professional lives. In a recent survey that we did, more than 3/4 of leaders like you have said that the benefits of Gen AI far outweigh its risks. Given its strategic importance, we've got to get it right. We cannot fail. And that's what this presentation is about. This presentation is about 10 best practices that we believe will allow you to scale Gen AI in a more safe and in a robust manner within your organization. This presentation is actually a culmination of a research note that I published 3 months ago, which in itself was derived from thousands of inquiries and tens of conversations that we've had with leading adopters. But before I give you the best practices, I have some bad news for you. We believe that over the next 18 months, more than 1/3 of generative AI projects will fail. They will fail to make it from proof of concept into production. Now, why do Gen AI projects fail? There are 4 fundamental reasons why we see Gen AI projects failing. The first is data. Remember that a lot of Gen AI use cases today leverage unstructured data. And unstructured data often is very poorly governed within the enterprise. And we also see challenges in bringing that unstructured data into LLM or Gen AI workflows. The second challenge that I see is governance, risk, and compliance, where we're often lax about GRC. And as we all know, Gen AI introduces a lot of new risks into the organization. For example, issues like hallucination or bias and toxicity at scale are newer problems that we are contending with. Third, escalating costs. The few cents per prompts that you're paying now in proof of concept, when you multiply that by thousands of prompts across hundreds of users, across tens of use cases, becomes a really large number. And finally, there are many generative AI products that we are starting to see that are convenient, that are nice to have, but they're not really a must-have, in the sense that the ultimate business value that they're providing is still highly questionable. And I think, again, this presentation is going to delve into how to kind of navigate some of these challenges and hopefully get to the part of the gold at the end of the mountain. I'm going to focus on 2 things today. One, I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of where enterprises are in their generative AI journey. And then I'm going to dwell into the 10 best practices that I spoke about earlier. What are the benefits and risks of Gen AI? These are fairly well chronicled, so I'll probably go through them really fast. The number one benefit that organizations are hoping to gain from Gen AI is really workforce productivity, right? Improvements in productivity across a variety of business functions: customer service, marketing, sales enablement, software development, DevOps and IT. You can go on and on. The models have also proven to be surprisingly versatile, which means that a same model can be applied across many different domains. For example, a model that can generate text, can also generate code, can also generate an image, and potentially can also generate speech and video in the future. Imagine this. In real world, that's the equivalent of a developer writing a poem or a poet knowing how to code applications. This could potentially simplify model lifecycle management within the enterprise. The ultimate goal of GenAI in the long run is to really democratize access to information and skills. Finding information within your organization or outside of your organization can now be possible through natural language. And not just natural language queries, but contextual natural language responses that can be delivered by large language models. But these benefits have to be balanced with the risks. And there are a number of risks that CIOs, CTOs, and CISOs are worried about. The number one risk is loss of confidential data. I don't want my data to be used by the model provider to train the model, nor do I want my data to be compromised in any way in a cloud environment. The risk of hallucination. I'm sure all of us know what hallucination is. Let's put it this way. Humility is not one of the greatest virtues of generative AI and large language models, which is when they don't know an answer to a question, they can often make up an answer. LLMs can also be notoriously black box in nature, which is when they provide a response, they often don't tell you, unless they're explicitly instructed, what part of the training data made them provide the response that they provided. Many of these models are trained on massive amounts of internet data in a self-supervised way, which clearly opens up a can of worms when it comes to copyright issues. And finally, there's clearly potential for misuse of these models. We've all seen the quality of deepfakes, unfortunately, significantly increase in precision in the last 18 months or so. So the bottom line is the challenges surrounding generative AI are non-trivial, for enterprise deployments. It is something that needs to be mitigated upfront. Where are customers in the Gen AI journey? This is from a survey. We've been running this survey every 4 months with some of the largest enterprise clients that Gartner has. And roughly 60% of the clients are telling us that they're either piloting or running Gen AI workloads in production. Roughly 1/5 of them are actually running Gen AI workloads in production today. As you can see here, that number is 21%, which is a pretty significant increase, almost a 5x increase over a 9-month period, if you think about it. Now, what are the inferences we can derive from the slide? I believe that there are 2 key inferences we can derive from the slide. First, when compared to classic machine learning projects, customers are launching and getting to pilots much more faster with Gen AI projects. The second inference we can derive from this is the board of directors and CEOs are increasingly getting involved in Gen AI projects. In fact, last week, I spent the whole of last week in Singapore, where I was invited to go and speak at an AI event that was convened by the Ministry of Defense in Singapore. And while I was in Singapore, I moderated a bunch of CIO panels. And one of the things that the CIOs were repeatedly telling me was the challenge that they have within the enterprise is explaining AI and really the possibilities of AI to the board and the senior management. When I think of Gen AI, it's really funny. We've had a lot of great breakthroughs in AI in the last 25 years, right? Right from AI beating the reigning chess champion in the 90s to, I don't know how many of you are a fan of the Jeopardy quiz show, where I'm sure you remember in 2011, you had Ken Jennings, of all people, being beaten by an AI or a computer or a machine, to the AlphaGo 7-8 years ago, where a computer built by DeepMind defeated the Go champion in Korea. So we've had a lot of these breakthroughs in the past. But yet, the ChatGPT breakthrough feels very different. Now, why is it very different? When I think of all of these other breakthroughs in the past, I think of them like an opera, going to an opera. What I mean by that is, you go to the opera, you sit in the audience, and you just admire The voice, the pitch at which the opera singers can sing, fully knowing that you can never do that. And that's coming from somebody who's actually a musician. I learned, Indian classical music, and I actually sing Indian classical music, right? But ChatGPT is like no rules football. You know what I mean? Which is, it's so accessible, and unfortunately, because of that, a lot of people believe that they're an expert in it, right? So the point is, we have seen a significant shift in enterprise thinking, where in the first half of 2023, the enterprise thinking around Gen AI and AI was very negative. In fact, the number one inquiry that Gartner used to get from clients like you was how to ban ChatGPT. That was the number one inquiry in the first half of 2023. And from there, we've just seen a significant shift as boards and CEOs recalibrate their thinking. And now increasingly, it's really about, hey, are we moving at the right speed? Are we picking the right use cases? Are we mitigating the risk? So I would term that the sentiment now is one of cautious optimism, if you want to call it. There's a lot of optimism, but of course, there's a fair amount of caution too. Now, if 60% of customers are piloting Gen AI or running workloads in production, where are they using AI today? We're seeing a variety of business functions where there is interest. There are 3 business functions that stand out for us, as you can see in the slides here. The number one business function where we see interest in Gen AI is in software development, which is no-brainer, right? Developers are always fast and quick to latch on to new tools. And we've clearly seen a lot of interest in using code generation and code completion tools to augment and improve the productivity of developers. The second domain where we see interest is in customer service. Not a lot of customer-facing customer service yet, although there is some amount of that, but a lot in back-end customer service. For example, I know Raj called out call center automation or contact center automation. That's a use case that we see a lot as well, where there is a lot of interest in using speech-to-text model for audio to text, doing summarization of that text. For example, an email could go to the manager of the call center agent on what the call was about, or doing sentiment analysis on that text, for example, particularly in scenarios where the customers are not leaving any surveys or responses in a call center scenario. Marketing is another domain where we see a fair amount of interest. Again, it's a no-brainer, honestly, to use Gen AI models in marketing. They can do a pretty good job of generating blog posts and marketing newsletters and social media feeds and so on and so forth, as long as you have a human in the loop. That's an important caveat there, right? We're also seeing some early interest in more DevOps and infrastructure functions as well, just to kind of round out that conversation. I want to take a slightly different view of the use cases, right? I think the earlier slide gave you more of a business view of the use cases. Let's take a slightly technical view of the use cases. Clearly, we see a lot of interest in the NLP domain, natural language processing, which is not surprising because most of these models are large language models, where the input of the model is a text and the output of a model is text as well. Within the NLP domain, there are 3 standout use cases that we see. The first is knowledge search, which is to use large language models on the back end to make enterprise search conversational and accessible to a really broad set of users. The second is summarization, often through conversational engines. Particularly, I think the summarization use case has gotten a lot more active given the context windows of these models are dramatically expanding, right? Because today there are many models that can deliver context windows greater than 100K in size today. The third use case obviously is text generation, as I said earlier, particularly popular in domains like marketing, comms, and advertising. We're also seeing interest in computer vision models, for generating computer vision images. I'm sure many of you are familiar with vision models like DALL-E or Stable Diffusion or Midjourney. We're also seeing the vision models being used for things like classification of images or object detection in images. For example, if you have unannotated images, you can use these models to do annotation of those images, which makes search of those images easier, it makes tagging of those images easier, and so on and so forth. I often tell customers, and I'm not joking when I say that I have stopped doing long-term predictions in AI. For the simple reason that I'm almost always going to get it wrong if I do long-term predictions. What I mean by that is, I made a prediction in 2023 that we will see text-to-video high-resolution models, really come into production in 2026. And I clearly know that that prediction is wrong now because of what we saw with Sora. I don't know how many of you saw some of the videos that are coming out of Sora as an example, which is pretty incredible in a really short span of time. I mean, nobody envisioned that we will get into the speech and the video multimodality that soon. I was saying that in the realm of computer vision use cases, by the way. We're seeing interest in IT use cases, as I shared earlier, software engineering, search, application modernization, moving from older languages or modernizing legacy applications. We're also seeing use cases within data and analytics, right? For example, using LLM for storytelling, using LLMs for data prep, and so on and so forth. Finally, we think the real game-changing use cases of generative AI are not far away from us, right? We're going to see them being used in drug discovery, which is something we've already started seeing, by the way, in genomic sequencing, new chemical formulation, and so on and so forth. So the real potential of this is going to be immense in the near term from the 2025 to the 2030 timeframe. So let's now spend a little bit of time, now that we've established where enterprises are in their AI journey, let's spend a little bit of time looking at what are some of the best practices that are emerging from people like you. The first and the foremost best practice that I would say for Gen AI is you need to establish a process for determining how you're going to pick your use cases for Gen AI. Because there are going to be so many people within your organization that's going to knock on your door and say, I've got this brilliant idea of where I think we should be using LLMs, right? And you need to have a process to prioritize it. Because having a process to prioritize it is important for two reasons. One, you're aligning your use cases with a broader ambition, AI ambition of the organization, in the sense that you're not shooting too high, nor are you shooting too low. It's also important from the perspective that you're not choosing the product from the flashiest demo that a vendor is going to show you, right? Which is you have a clear internal North Star in terms of the use cases you want to pursue. I promise you, this is the only slide that I'm going to sell Gartner, and I'm sorry, my intention was not to sell Gartner here. But one of the frameworks that Gartner has created is really around how to prioritize use cases. We kind of categorize use cases into a 2x2 matrix. On one axis, you have business value. For example, on business value, you would ask questions such as, hey, what is the time to value for this use case? Do we have support and sponsorship from the business? Do we have support from the data owners that actually own the data in the business, and so on? And on the other axis, you have technical feasibility. Under technical feasibility, you would ask questions such as, hey, what is the risk of implementing this use case? If you're buying a Gen AI product for that use case, are there enough commercial vendors out in the market from whom we can buy the product? So the ultimate exercise of this essentially is a categorization where you're going to pick use cases that are high in business value and high in technical feasibility. And you can essentially do that as a self-diagnostic exercise within your organization. You don't have to follow our template, honestly, our framework. I mean, you could create a similar framework on your own. But the broader idea is to have very clear goals in terms of what is technical feasible and what is going to yield the most business value. This is like a sample that I did for you to just look at. Sorry for the fonts a little bit there. The second question that I think you need to ponder really is, do I build? Do I buy? Isn't that the classic question with software in general and specifically with AI? For Gen AI, we believe that there are 5 different ways in which organizations can consume Gen AI. The first and foremost is where you consume generative AI as an application, in the sense that it's a feature or a functionality into an application that you're already using or a net new application that you're buying, right? There are many different application vendors. I know that the folks at Kore.ai are building some of these application services as well, right? By and far, it's the most simple and seamless way to bring GenAI into the organization, right? Because it's part of the existing workflow. The users are very familiar with some of these tools, and it's a more seamless way to bring it into the organization. The second way to consume GenAI is where the models are often running in the cloud. And the models are delivered as an API, right? I mean, most of the models that exist today, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, you name it, they all offer their models, and they're available as an API. And you can embed those APIs into custom applications that you're building within the organization, right? Which means that in most scenarios, you're going to be doing prompt engineering. Yes, that dreaded term, which I'm sure many of you have heard before. At a very simplistic level, prompt engineering is how we steer and guide these models into providing responses that we want from them. So you're primarily doing prompt engineering of these models because the models are frozen and the models kind of are running in the cloud for the most part. But real value within the enterprise is created only if you're able to combine our data and our domain knowledge with these models. Because the models by themselves are general purpose technologies, if you know what I mean, right? They're massively pre-trained, but they're general purpose. They don't have a lot of context of your organization or context of your domain. Now, there are two ways in which you can combine your data with these models. The first of those approaches is called RAG. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with RAG. RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, where you represent your organizational data as a spatial or a mathematical representation that can be combined with the model at the inferencing. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with vector search, vector embeddings, and so on, where you're representing your data in a way that can be read by these models, and you're combining that with the inference, which is the model is still frozen. That's the more important point with RAG, because keeping the model frozen is important from the cost of ownership, right? Because you're only paying for the inferencing of the model, because you're not changing the model. But the data is augmenting the model response. A simple example of this could be an HR chatbot, right? For example, you built an HR chatbot, and you're asking, hey, what is the parental leave policy of your organization? If you ask this question to ChatGPT, it has no idea. It doesn't, maybe it will still give you an answer, but that's a different point. But it doesn't have an idea in most cases. But with the RAG, you're essentially telling your model, hey, here is an internal data source from where you can dip and fetch an answer. And that's really what happens in a RAG architecture. The fourth is where you're actually fine-tuning a model. So what is fine-tuning out a model? At a very basic level, fine-tuning a model is taking a base model, bringing your data into it, and retraining the model to be a custom model that is kind of dedicated to your organization or dedicated to that use case. And finally, you can build your own model from the scratch, which is something that we actively dissuade customers from doing at this point in time, just given the sheer complexity and the sheer costs of doing it. And also, frankly speaking, the model ecosystem is changing so fast that building a model from the scratch is going to take you months, and in some sense, it's going to be like dead on arrival, because by then, the ecosystem has clearly moved on, to become a lot more advanced. Now, why is this decision framework important? For two reasons. One, because there are cost implications across which approach you're choosing. There are complexity implications across which approach you're choosing. There are privacy implications across which approach you're choosing. So if you go back to the earlier slide where you had a bunch of use cases, you want to align those use cases to the right approaches, where you say, for these approaches, we're going to do RAG. For these approaches, we're just going to do simple prompt engineering of the model. For these approaches, we're just going to buy a GenAI app, rather than trying to do something on our own, right? So that categorization, to me, is very important. What's also important to me is when you select a model provider, you pay enough attention to their model training process, their security and privacy practices, how they simplify prompt engineering within your organization. Obviously, the pricing aspect is very important as well. So it also gives you a little bit more depth in terms of determining who are the vendors that you want to work with. The broader point essentially is you want to set the bar very high in terms of what it takes to work with you. This is a very obvious recommendation, right, which is run pilots, before you, move workloads into production. I know this sounds like very cliche, very obvious advice, but you would be surprised by the number of people that don't do it, which is they don't run pilots, or they don't really run pilots at scale. And running pilots at scale is important because it allows you to envision your future scalability needs, your data integration needs, your privacy and security needs, and so on and so forth. And I also believe pilots are an important best practice because it brings a lot of muscle memory within the organization. Because at the end of the day, with Gen AI, you're trying to imagine the art of possible, or maybe even the art of impossible, if you want to call it, right? So you're trying to do new things. So, iterating against those new things is very important, and pilots obviously are one of the ways to do it more effectively. And the end goal of a pilot, in my opinion, should be threefold, right? After you've run the pilot, you're going to make one of these three decisions. Either the pilot has run very well, and you're like, hey, let's go ahead and scale it. Or you say, hey, these things, the model did very well, but these were like things that the model did not do very well. And you go back and refine these models. In fact, one of the practices from a safety perspective that is becoming very important is an approach called red teaming. I don't know how many of you have heard of that term before. In a simple sense, red teaming is the pen test equivalent in the Gen AI world, where you're essentially testing the model for safety, particularly against things like prompt injection style attacks, and you're refining the model to make sure that it's avoiding those attack vectors. Or maybe the pilot did not just deliver value. It was just not the right fit for the use case you're imagining, which means that you stop your losses then and there and you move to a new use case. One of the practices we are starting to see across many enterprises now is they're all creating AI sandboxes. Now, what is an AI sandbox? I think fundamentally there are two characteristics of an AI sandbox. The first is you have some basic privacy and safety built into the sandbox, which means that any data that you're bringing into the sandbox has basic privacy protection against it. For example, that data will not be used to train the model that's running in the background. That data is, encrypted, masked, whatsoever. Secondly, organizations are trying to bring multiple models into that sandbox environment. They want to mix large language models with small language models so that developers have a choice of price performance they can choose for these models. And often we're also starting to see them mix, increasingly in the last 9 months, closed source models with open source models. As you probably know, there's been a lot of revolution in the open source space. Llama 2 from Meta, Mistral, Databricks recently, and so on and so forth. The next best practice that we advocate is you have to determine how your Gen AI platform is going to look like. We fundamentally think that Gen AI platform today is a 4-layer cake. You have the infrastructure. Obviously, you require specialized infrastructure for running or tuning these models. You have the models themselves. You have what we call as LLM ops, ML ops, engineering tools that allow us to customize, automate, and more safely deploy these models. And then you have the applications themselves, right? A variety of vertical specific and more business function specific applications. Most organizations have two choices. Either they can go vertical with a single vendor, in the sense that the entire stack is provided by a single vendor, which is what most of the big cloud providers want you to do, right? Which is they want you to choose the entire stack from them. Or you could choose a more disaggregated stack, which is you choose best-of-breed components across each of these layers. We fundamentally believe that many organizations will take a more disaggregated approach to the stack. We believe that organizations should build a more composable platform architecture. What we mean by a composable architecture is you have the ability to swap the models at will, because the models are going to change, the models are going to rapidly evolve, and having a very strong dependency on a single provider is just not going to serve you very well in the long run, right? So building a more modular or a composable architecture is very critical in our opinion in this space, particularly given the pace at which this ecosystem is evolving. The other advice that I often give to customers is, often customers come to me and say, hey, Arun, tell me what's the best model that's out there. I mean, there's nothing called best model, as you probably know. It's really about the right model for the right use case, right? Because Of course, GPT-4 Turbo is a phenomenal model. Of course, Claude 3 Opus is a phenomenal model. But is that a model that we would recommend for every use case within your organization? Of course, the answer is no, right? Because it might be an overkill. I mean, I often joke that, choosing the largest model for every use case within your organization is like Arun hiring a PhD from MIT in math to teach my third grade daughter how to do 4 multiplied by 5, right? Of course, the MIT PhD in math is phenomenal, but it's an overkill for the use case that I'm trying to, bring him or her to. We all understand the importance of responsible AI, and we all understand the need to put responsible AI at the forefront of how we think about Gen AI deployments within the organization. Because as we said earlier, Gen AI and large language models do introduce new risks. And I would even go to the point where I would argue that responsible AI should be a critical lens even in choosing the initial use cases, right? That should be one of the important input factors in terms of selecting the use cases. So what do we advocate? One of the things we advocate is to create a responsible AI framework or a responsible AI vision within the organization. Obviously, I've got a bunch of things that I've said here, but let me try to simplify that for you, right? I think there are 4 key things that are very important in a responsible AI framework. The first is data privacy, right? Very intuitive, super important to protect your intellectual property. The second is security. The models are vulnerable for new forms of attacks, like prompt injection style attacks or data poisoning attacks and so on and so forth, and we need to have tools and processes to protect them. The third is accountability. Accountability at a human level, which is you have a very clear product owner or a platform owner that is responsible for the application of AI in that digital product. And it's also an accountability at the model layer, where you have interpretability and explainability of these models, where we understand why the models are doing what they're doing, right? For example, if you're using AI for making loan approval decisions, you can't go and tell your customer your loan was rejected because my AI system said so, right? We need to have the ability to explain to them why the models are making the decisions they are. And the last pillar is fairness, where the models are being deployed in a fair way, where we are mitigating the bias, toxicity, and the harmful risk of it. In fact, by and far, the fairness is the hardest one to overcome because, as we all know, bias is in the eyes of the beholder. In fact, when I was in the Middle East actually a few weeks ago, and this is such a hot topic because in the Middle East, they believe that the models embody quote unquote American values. You know what I mean? You really get into very difficult territory, right? I mean, because you ask models questions about climate change or like same-sex marriage, for example, they're going to espouse a view that at some level you could argue that as not universally accepted. I mean, we can debate whether it's right or wrong. So, steering the models to actually reflect the environment, reflect the vision and the values of the company is a very important aspect as well. The next one is very obvious, which is we have to invest in data and AI literacy. And when we think about literacy in a bunch of ways. And I don't know why the slide is not showing up here. So data and AI literacy is very critical. And I think of data and literacy in a couple of ways. One, in terms of literacy to the business people, right? Where we need to train them on simple prompt engineering techniques, on the importance of responsible AI in terms of the use cases they envision. But we also need to think about literacy to the technical people. For example, more advanced prompt engineering skills, like, for example, how to do RAG at scale or how to do fine-tuning. ML engineering skills or AI engineering skills, how to monitor these models. This whole new role that is becoming very prominent called AI engineer, who are primarily, like the SRE equivalent, if you want to call it in the AI world. That's becoming one of the fastest growing roles that we're seeing in the marketplace today. So we advocate to customers to embark on a personalized training program, both to business folks as well as to the technical folks. And I don't want to ignore the human impact of this, right? There are many folks that are still fearing their jobs and, and so on and so forth. And I always tell people, AI is not going to take your job, but AI is going to automate tasks. And we have to figure out how we envision the tasks that we want to do in the future, where either we are functioning in a more harmonious way with AI, or we're doing things, perhaps that the AI cannot do, right? So we have to really start thinking about tasks we want to do. But as leaders who are sitting here, you certainly have an opportunity to partner with HR and embark on an upskilling program within the organization, as well as to do more open mic style sessions to remove a lot of the FUD that kind of exists in the minds of employees. AI is only as good as the data that it's part of, right? And there are a couple of ways in which we need to think about how we want to bring data into AI. One, obviously, is through approaches like RAG and fine-tuning, where we have to train our employees. We have to improve the quality of tools that we're using so that we can do RAG and fine-tuning effectively at scale. The other way to think about this is GenAI is not going to run in a vacuum, right? GenAI is not a panacea. GenAI often needs to be augmented with other AI techniques. For example, using ontologies or knowledge graphs along with GenAI is a very popular way to actually reduce hallucinations of these models, right? So we also have to evolve our data ecosystem to accommodate other AI techniques that could be complementary to large language models and GenAI. We need to ensure a more seamless collaboration between humans and machines, which is a bit challenging today because AI is often not organized around human workflows. And there's also a lot of mistrust and distrust of AI emanating from human beings. So there are a couple of things that we advocate. The one is very obvious, which is to make sure that you have a human in the loop or a human in the middle that is vetting the output of these models, given the propensity of these models to produce misinformation once in a while. What I think is also important is you create communities of practices within different business functions and within different teams to spread the know-how, to spread the knowledge, particularly around prompt engineering, particularly around responsible and secure way of interacting and dealing with these models. I would also advocate another thing, which is to use tools that are natively integrating with existing tools that people are using. For example, if I'm using AI for code generation, I don't want to go to another browser. I don't want to go to another application to copy and paste code, right? I want that to be natively integrated into my IDE, into my development engine. So to the extent possible, AI should be seamlessly integrated into the tools and workflows that users have today. We spoke about how AI cost of ownership can very rapidly scale within enterprises. Now, there are a few things we could be doing to stop that. One is there are things we could be doing architecturally. For example, not doing extensive customization of AI, not choosing the largest model that's out there for all of the use cases. Those are simple things we could be doing architecturally. But we could also be doing a lot of things operationally. For example, more effective prompt engineering can reduce the cost of ownership because you're guiding the models to be concise and precise in their responses. We've also started seeing some very creative practices. For example, I know a bunch of customers that use LLM caching. What they do is they cache the responses from the models that are running in the cloud, which means that if two people are asking the same prompt or a similar prompt, you're not even making an API call for the second prompt because you're essentially serving the response from a local cache within your organization. So there are a lot of things we could also be doing operationally to reduce the cost. And of course, training employees is a really big part of it as well, right? Again, how to guide, how to steer these models in a more efficient way. And last but not least is, vendors like Kore.ai, for example, they have roles like product managers, right? And I believe that more and more end-user organizations need to emulate those roles as well. And I particularly think the role of a product owner and a product manager is important in GenAI for two reasons. The first reason really is this is an ecosystem that's evolving really, really rapidly, which means that these product owners are constantly looking at the future and bringing new models and new techniques into it so that the digital product that they're using AI for stays current. The other reason why having a product owner is important is because it allows them to talk directly to the users. AI is going to be new for a lot of users. But unfortunately, most of your users are going to use AI tools in the next 3 years. which means that we have to gather early feedback from those users and incorporate those feedback into the product. This could be very simple things, like a thumbs up, thumbs down for model responses, or the user experience. For example, a lot of the user experience is very textual and text-centered today. Maybe if you're putting these tools in front of millennials, they may prefer voice, or they may prefer other kind of modalities from a user experience standpoint. So really gaining insight into your users and their preferences is very important to ensure that the tools that you're building are being used by the users, right? Because you don't want to sit in an ivory tower and build a product that kind of nobody uses within the organization, because we know what happens then. That's when shadow IT happens, essentially, right? Because there are better tools out there that they will gravitate towards. So in a nutshell, we believe that these 10 best practices will allow you to scale GenAI in a more safe and in a more meaningful way within your organization. Again, this slide kind of categorizes the best practices into 4 different areas: things you could do on the orchestration side, things you could do architecturally, things you could do in terms of literacy and education, and fundamentally more responsible AI practices that you could imbibe within the organization. I told you that I'm not stupid enough to make long-term forecasts, but I am stupid enough to make short-term forecasts. Because a question that I often get asked is, hey, what does the next 12 to 18 months really look like in the field of GenAI? After all, I'm an analyst, and we're supposed to do predictions, aren't we? There are 6 key futures that we see for GenAI. The first is really the advent of small language models. Task-specific and small language models are starting to challenge the large language models in terms of accuracy for specific tasks. We are particularly seeing a sweet spot of hundreds and millions of parameters to 10 billion parameters is where we're starting to see a lot of new models emerge in the market. The second is something that I alluded to earlier, which is the rise of open source models. Particularly, as I mentioned earlier, Meta, Mistral, Databricks are all examples of companies that are building commercially viable, commercially supported open source models. The third is the rise of domain models. We're also starting to see more vendors building models for specific vertical industries, where they're taking general purpose models and they're training them on domain-specific data. For example, if you're in financial services, they're taking a general purpose model and training it on SEC information. Financial earnings call reports, 10K, 8K reports, and so on and so forth. We're seeing similar models in life sciences with FDA information. We're seeing it in healthcare with PubMed information. We're seeing this in law firms with like court records, for example. So there are many industries where we're starting to see the advent of domain models, which could go even further in terms of being more accurate, hopefully, in terms of business process-specific tasks. Clearly, regulations is going to be another key trend that we're going to watch in the next 18 months. For those of you who work for global companies, or for those of you who are here from Europe, we all know that the EU AI Act is going to become a law anytime soon. It's already been ratified by the EU Parliament. It's going to become a law anytime soon, which is going to be one of the first cross-country regulation that is not just AI specific, that is actually Gen AI specific. And we expect, in very similar to what happened with GDPR like 6 years ago, we expect a lot of other countries to follow maybe the EU AI Act and enact their own legislation surrounding AI and Gen AI, particularly given that this is an election year in many countries, by the way. Apparently 2.5 billion people in the world are going to go out in elections, so there's a big political pressure and political onus as well around these regulations, given the amount of deepfakes that you're starting to see in the political spectrum today. The models are going multimodal, which is models that were primarily text and code-based or increasingly incorporating other modalities. Image was a modality that they started incorporating, and speech and video are clearly modalities that we see becoming part of these models. So increasingly, models will take multiple inputs: image, video, speech, text, code, and they can also produce multiple modalities of output. Again, all of the modalities that I mentioned in the input. And finally, the big North Star for a lot of companies is autonomous agents. What is an autonomous agent? An autonomous agent is an agent that can take high-level instructions from human beings and they can orchestrate a series of steps. Because if you think about tools like ChatGPT today, while they're phenomenal, they still require a lot of human intervention, right? They still require a lot of prompting. Whereas with autonomous agents, for example, you can say, hey, I want to start a business. And then the tool says, oh, these are the top 5 businesses that solo entrepreneurs are successful with. Oh, I can go and create a company name for you. I can go and check if the domain name is available on the ICANN. Hey, I'm good at creating logos. I can create a logo for the company. I know a little bit of HTML skills. I can go and create a mock-up website for you. So the ability of some of these autonomous agents to orchestrate a series of execution steps based on a higher level instruction offers a lot of potential, but it also carries a lot of risks, particularly in terms of the black box nature of some of these agents. I won't wade into the whole AGI debate here, around human level intelligence and so on and so forth, but there are research labs that believe that autonomous agents is kind of a step towards that eventual promise of having a machine with a very high degree of intelligence. So in a nutshell, prioritize your use cases in terms of which ones you want to pursue initially. Bring a lot of engineering practices in terms of how you scale your projects, particularly agile thinking, sandbox environments, composability, FinOps, product-centric delivery model. Put responsible AI at front and center of how you prioritize use cases and how you scale these use cases within the organization. And finally, invest in AI literacy skills, both in the business and in the technology team. And one of the beauties of LLMs and GenAI is there is so much we can learn by doing than by rote classroom learning. So make sure that your training programs are more doing-oriented rather than kind of knowing-oriented as you roll these out within the organization. With that, I thank you very much for this time, and I hope this presentation was useful to you, and I wish you all a wonderful conference.